The heaviest burdens we carry aren't the ones placed on our shoulders. They're the ones we place on our own conscience. The Miami heat pressed against the hotel windows like an unwelcome confession as veteran sports reporter Marcus Sterling adjusted his tie for the third time. It was July 1974, and he'd covered hundreds of athletes, but something about sitting across from Muhammad Ali made his hands shake. At 52, Mac had built his reputation on asking the hard questions, but today felt different, charged with an electricity he couldn't name. "So, champ," Mac began, forcing his trademark smirk, "I heard you've been training with some interesting company lately." The racial joke that followed hung in the air like smoke, crude and calculated for easy laughs. But Ali didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward with eyes that seemed to see straight through time itself. "Mr. Sterling," Ali said quietly, "tell me about Birmingham. Tell me about the alley behind Morrison's Diner. Tell me about the night you watched 3 men drag away a boy who looked just like me." The blood drained from Mac's face. No one knew about that night. No one could know. How could Muhammad Ali describe the moment that had haunted Mac's dreams for 11 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cameraman's equipment suddenly felt too heavy in Jimmy's hands. He'd been shooting interviews with Mac Sterling for 3 years, but he'd never seen his boss go pale like that. Not when they'd cornered corrupt city officials. Not when they'd ambushed lying coaches. Not even when that heavyweight from Detroit had threatened to break both their legs. Mac's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The cigarette between his fingers burned down to his knuckles, but he didn't seem to notice. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mac finally managed, his voice stripped of its usual swagger. The words came out thin and reedy, like air escaping from a punctured tire. Ali didn't move. He sat perfectly still in the cheap hotel chair, his massive frame somehow managing to look both relaxed and coiled, like a panther that had already decided when to strike. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered, casting shifting shadows across his face. "November 15th, 1963, Ali continued in that same quiet voice. "You were covering a story about the lunch counter protests for the Birmingham Herald. You'd been drinking at Morrison's Diner, 3 whiskey sours if memory serves, when you stepped out back for some air. The room felt like it was shrinking. Mac could hear his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably behind the camera, clearly sensing something had gone terribly wrong but not understanding what. How? Mac started, then stopped. His usual repertoire of deflections and jokes had abandoned him completely. "The boy was 17, Ali said. "Skinny kid, big dreams. Believed he could change the world with words and peaceful protests. Believed in the goodness of people, even when they gave him every reason not to." Mac's hands were trembling now. He gripped the edge of the small table between them, his knuckles white against the scarred wood. The hotel room reeked of stale cigarettes and something else, fear maybe, or guilt, that had finally found its way to the surface after 11 years of careful burial. 3 men, Ali continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "Big men, white men, you knew one of them, Officer Bradley from the precinct. You'd interviewed him just 2 weeks before about some petty theft case." The images came flooding back, despite Mac's desperate attempts to push them down. The alley, the shouting, the kids' eyes, wide with terror and disbelief, scanning the darkness until they found Mac hiding in the shadows. The moment when those eyes pleaded for help that never came. "I was just," Mac's voice cracked, "I was just one man. There were 3 of them. They were cops, for Christ's sake." "Were they?" Ali asked, tilting his head slightly. "Or was one of them a cop, and the other 2 just men who knew they could get away with anything, as long as they had a badge for cover?" Jimmy lowered his camera. "Mac, what's going on? Should I keep rolling?" Neither man acknowledged him. The air conditioning unit beneath the window rattled and wheezed, struggling against the oppressive Miami heat, but the sweat on Mac's forehead had nothing to do with the temperature. "The boy called for help," Ali said. "Called out to the shadows where he'd seen you watching. Called your name, actually. He'd recognized you from your newspaper photo." That detail hit Mac like a physical blow. He'd forgotten that part, or maybe he'd just buried it so deep that it couldn't surface during his nightly reconstructions of guilt. But it was true. The kid had known who he was. "Mr. Sterling," Ali quoted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Please, Mr. Sterling, help me." "Stop." The word came out harsh and desperate. Mac stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the thin carpet. "Just stop. I don't know how you know about that night, but you want to know why I know," Ali finished. He stood, too, his 6'3" frame unfolding with fluid grace. "You want to know how Muhammad Ali came to learn about a moment that's been eating at your soul for 11 years? Mac nodded, unable to speak. Ali walked to the window and gazed out at the Miami skyline, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everything in the room. "That boy you watched disappear into the night? That skinny kid with big dreams who believed in the power of peaceful protest?" He turned back to face Mac. "His name was Rahman Ali. He was my little brother." The hotel room went completely silent except for the labored breathing of the air conditioner and the distant sound of Miami traffic. Jimmy's camera hung forgotten in his hands. Mac felt the world tilt sideways. 11 years of carefully constructed justifications crumbling in an instant. "And Marcus Sterling," Ali said softly. "It's time we talked about what really happened to him." The words hung in the stifling air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mac's legs gave out and he sank back into his chair, the cheap plastic creaking under his weight. His mouth moved but no sound emerged, as if the revelation had stolen not just his voice but his very breath. "Your brother," he finally whispered. "Jesus Christ, your brother." Ali remained standing by the window, his silhouette backlit by the harsh Miami afternoon sun. The light carved deep shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. "Rahman," he said quietly. 2 years younger than me, always had his nose in books, always talking about Dr. King, about changing hearts and minds through love instead of fists." Mac's hands shook as he reached for another cigarette, the flame from his lighter dancing wildly. He thought about his own life, his cramped apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay, his standing Tuesday poker game with the other sports reporters, his carefully maintained routine of work and bourbon and forgetting. He thought about his ex-wife Sandra, who'd left him 3 years ago claiming he was spiritually bankrupt, whatever the hell that meant. He thought about his daughter Karen, 24 now and living in Seattle, who called maybe twice a year and always sounded disappointed in him even when discussing the weather. What did he have to lose? His job at the Miami Herald, where he'd scraped together a decent reputation covering local sports and the occasional scandal? His apartment lease that was up for renewal next month? His liver, which his doctor kept warning him about in increasingly stern tones? But even as he catalogued his modest, solitary existence, Mac realized it wasn't what he might lose that terrified him. It was what he'd already lost. The man he might have been if he'd stepped out of those shadows 11 years ago. The husband Sandra might have stayed married to if he wasn't haunted by something he could never explain. The father Karen might respect if guilt didn't leak out of him like radiation from a cracked reactor. "I've been covering sports for 27 years, Mac said, his voice hoarse. "Started when I was 25, fresh out of journalism school with big ideas about uncovering corruption and fighting the good fight." He laughed bitterly. "You know what I learned? It's easier to write about box scores than ask hard questions. Easier to joke about a fighter's accent than examine your own soul." Jimmy shifted nervously behind his camera. "Mac, maybe we should—" "Should what?" Mac snapped, whirling around to face his cameraman. "Pack up and pretend this never happened? Go back to my efficiency apartment and my TV dinners and my nightly routine of drinking until I can't remember why I hate myself?" The outburst surprised everyone in the room, including Mac himself. He'd spent 11 years perfecting the art of emotional containment, building elaborate walls around the night that had hollowed him out from the inside. Now those walls were crumbling, and he could feel something raw and desperate clawing its way to the surface. Ali finally turned from the window. "Every morning for 11 years you wake up and remember," he said. It wasn't a question. Mac nodded slowly. "Like clockwork, 5:37 a.m. every single day. That's when I wake up, and for about 10 seconds, everything's normal. Then it comes flooding back. The alley, the voices, the way he looked at me when—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "The way he looked at you when you chose to stay hidden." "Yes." The word came out like a confession at a tribunal. Ali moved back to his chair, settling his large frame into it with surprising grace. "Tell me about your life now, Marcus. Tell me what you've built on that foundation of silence." So Mac told him about the apartment with the leaky faucet and the neighbor's cat that kept him awake at night. About the Thursday evening dinners at Flanagan's Pub, where he ate the same meatloaf special and watched the same bartender water down the same cheap whiskey. About the Christmas cards from Karen with brief, impersonal messages signed Love K. About the medical checkups where he lied to his doctor about how much he drank, as if dishonesty could somehow postpone the inevitable reckoning with his own mortality. He talked about his editor, Bob Grimes, who kept threatening to fire him for missing deadlines and showing up to interviews smelling like bourbon. He talked about the athletes he interviewed, mostly local high school kids and has-been college players, who looked at him with the kind of pity usually reserved for roadkill. "It's a small life," Mac concluded. "Deliberately small. I figured if I didn't reach for anything important, I couldn't fail at anything that mattered." Ali listened without judgment, his dark eyes focused with an intensity that made Mac feel simultaneously exposed and understood. When Mac finished speaking, the room fell silent again, except for the persistent rattle of the air conditioner and the distant sound of Miami traffic. "And yet," Ali said finally, "you're here." Mac stared at Ali, the simple observation hitting him like a revelation. "Yeah," he said slowly, "I am here." He stubbed out his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray, his hands steadier now. "Funny thing is, I almost didn't come. Grimes had to threaten to fire me to get me to take this assignment. But you came anyway." "I came anyway." Mac leaned back in his chair, studying Ali's face. "You know, when I made that joke earlier, that stupid racist joke, I was testing something. Testing whether I was still the same coward I was 11 years ago. Whether I'd still choose the easy path, the cruel laugh, over doing what's right." Ali's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "And what did you discover?" Before Mac could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the hotel room. Jimmy nearly dropped his camera, the sudden sound making everyone freeze. The knock came again, more insistent this time, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones. Ali's entire demeanor changed. The contemplative heavyweight vanished, replaced by something alert and dangerous. He held up a hand for silence, his eyes fixed on the door. "Rahman?" he called softly. Mac's blood turned to ice water. The dead brother. Ali was calling to his dead brother, Muhammad. The voice that answered came from beyond the door, muffled but unmistakably real. "It's time." Jimmy's camera clattered to the floor. Mac felt reality tilt sideways, 11 years of guilt and alcohol and carefully maintained numbness evaporating in an instant. The voice belonged to a man, alive, breathing, speaking from the hotel hallway. Ali stood and walked to the door, his movements fluid despite his size. "Marcus," he said without turning around, "in about 30 seconds, you're going to have to make a choice. The same choice you faced in that Birmingham alley, but this time with 11 years of wisdom and regret to guide you." "I don't understand," Mac whispered. "My brother didn't die that night." Ali's hand rested on the door handle, but he disappeared, vanished so completely that even I believed he was gone forever, until 6 months ago when he found me, when he told me about a sports reporter who witnessed everything and did nothing. The room spun around Mac. "He's been alive all this time?" "All this time, living under a different name, in different cities, always moving, always hiding. Because those 3 men, Officer Bradley and his friends, they didn't just beat him that night. They made him an offer. Disappear forever, or they'd come back and finish the job. Not just on him, but on our whole family." Mac thought about 17-year-old Rahman Ali, dragged into that alley while a journalist cowered in the shadows. He thought about the terror in those young eyes, the desperate plea for help that had gone unanswered. Now that same person stood beyond a hotel door in Miami, no longer 17, no longer innocent, but alive. "What choice?" Mac asked, though part of him already knew. Ali turned the handle slowly. "Rahman has spent 11 years gathering evidence. Names, dates, connections that go all the way to the top of Birmingham's power structure. The kind of story that could bring down a network of corruption and violence that's been operating since before either of us was born. The door opened a few inches, revealing a sliver of hallway and a shadow that might have been a man. But, Ali continued, he needs a witness. Someone who was there that night. Someone whose testimony could corroborate his story and give it the credibility it needs. He paused, looking directly at Mac. Someone who's been running from the truth for 11 years and might be ready to finally face it. The Birmingham police, the city officials, they'll destroy me, Mac said. My career, my life, everything. Yes, Ali agreed. They probably will. Just like they destroyed Rahman's childhood, his innocence, his faith in justice. Just like they would have destroyed him completely if he hadn't agreed to become a ghost. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps, deliberate, patient, waiting. Mac looked around the hotel room that had become a confessional, a courtroom, a crossroads. Jimmy stood frozen by his fallen camera, mouth agape. The air conditioner rattled its mechanical death song. Outside the window, Miami pulsed with life and heat and possibility. If I walk away now, Mac said, if I just pack up and go back to my small life, then nothing changes, Ali finished. Rahman stays a ghost. The men who destroyed him stay in power. And you wake up at 5:37 every morning for the rest of your life, remembering the night you had 2 chances to be brave and chose silence both times. The footsteps in the hallway stopped directly outside the door. Choose, Ali said simply, stepping aside so Mac had a clear path to the exit or to whatever waited beyond the threshold. But choose as the man you are now, not the coward you were then. Mac's legs felt like concrete pillars rooted to the cheap hotel carpet. The doorway gaped before him like the mouth of some great beast, and beyond it waited a ghost made flesh. Rahman Ali, the 17-year-old boy whose terrified eyes had haunted 11 years of sleepless dawns. I can't, Mac whispered, the words scraping his throat raw. You don't understand what you're asking. But even as he spoke, his mind raced through the implications. Birmingham. Officer Bradley, who'd probably made detective by now, maybe even captain. The other 2 men, whose faces Mac could still see with crystalline clarity, likely prosperous, respectable pillars of their community. They'd built their lives on the assumption that their secret was buried with a dead boy who'd turned out to be very much alive. Tell me what I don't understand, Ali said quietly. Mac's hands trembled as he lit another cigarette, buying time he didn't have. You see this? He gestured at himself. The rumpled shirt, the bloodshot eyes, the slight tremor that had nothing to do with caffeine withdrawal. This is what 11 years of guilt does to a man. This is what I became after one night of cowardice. Now you want me to stand up in front of judges and juries and reporters to put my name in newspapers next to words like witness and testimony and justice. The shadow in the hallway shifted almost imperceptibly. Rahman, waiting, patient as death itself. They'll dig into my life, Mac continued, his voice gaining a manic edge. Every story I ever wrote, every source I ever protected, every corner I ever cut. They'll find the times I buried stories because the subjects were too powerful, too connected. They'll find the interviews where I pulled punches because I was scared of litigation, scared of losing access, scared of being brave, Ali finished. Yes, the admission exploded out of him. Scared of being brave, because look what happened the one time I tried to do the right thing. I froze. I hid in shadows while a kid got beaten half to death 20 feet away from me. What makes you think I won't freeze again when Bradley and his friends come for me with lawyers and threats and— Because, Ali interrupted, his voice cutting through Mac's spiral of panic, you already froze. You already failed. The worst thing that could happen to you already happened 11 years ago in that alley. Everything since then has just been the echo. Mac stared at him, cigarette forgotten between his fingers. Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, and for a moment he was back in Birmingham, back in the shadows, paralyzed by the sight of uniforms and badges and the terrible understanding that sometimes the law and justice were strangers to each other. My daughter, he said suddenly. Karen. She's building a life in Seattle, working for an environmental nonprofit. She's got a boyfriend, nice kid, going to law school. She's finally starting to respect me again, or at least pretend to. When this comes out, when my name is connected to this story, she'll know her father finally found his courage, Ali said. She'll know her father was a coward who watched a kid get beaten and did nothing. Mac's voice cracked. She'll know I've been lying to her for 11 years about who I really am. Jimmy cleared his throat nervously. Mac, maybe we should go. This is getting heavy and I don't think… Shut up, Jimmy. Mac didn't take his eyes off Ali. This isn't about you. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. From the hallway came the soft sound of breathing, proof that Rahman Ali existed, that the nightmare Mac had carried for over a decade was about to demand payment in full. What if I can't do it? Mac whispered. What if I get up there and freeze again? What if my testimony falls apart under cross-examination? What if I make things worse for him than they already are? Ali leaned forward in his chair. Then at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have chosen to step out of the shadows instead of hiding in them. Mac thought about his small apartment, his Thursday dinners at Flanagan's, his carefully constructed routine of mediocrity and avoidance. He thought about Sandra's last words before she left. You're already dead, Marcus. You just haven't stopped breathing yet. He thought about Rahman Ali at 17, young, idealistic, believing in justice and change, and the possibility that words could transform the world. Then he thought about whatever Rahman had become during 11 years of hiding, 11 years of being a ghost in his own life. If I walk through that door, Mac said, there's no going back. No, Ali agreed. There isn't. The footsteps in the hallway shifted again, waiting, patient but not infinite. Mac closed his eyes and saw the alley again, saw those terrified young eyes pleading for help that never came. When he opened them, Ali was watching him with something that might have been compassion. I'm 52 years old, Mac said. I'm scared. Good, Ali replied. Fear means it matters. Mac Sterling stood up. The movement felt monumental, as if his body was fighting against gravity itself. His legs shook, his knees nearly buckled, but he remained upright. The cigarette fell from his fingers, landing on the stained carpet where it smoldered like a small funeral pyre for his old life. Jimmy, he said without turning around, his voice surprisingly steady. Pack up the camera. Thank God, Jimmy breathed, relief flooding his voice. I thought you were actually going to… Pack it up, Mac repeated, because we're not leaving. We're documenting what happens next. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause in its mechanical wheeze, as if the entire world was holding its breath for this moment of transformation. Ali's face showed no surprise, no vindication, only a quiet acknowledgement that some crossroads once reached demand to be crossed. Mac took a step toward the door, then another. Each footfall echoed in the cramped room like a judge's gavel. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in 11 years. The tremor that had plagued him since Birmingham, barely noticeable but always there, a constant reminder of his cowardice, had vanished. Muhammad, he said, stopping just short of the threshold. Before I walk through this door, I need you to know something. I need you to understand what you've done here. Ali waited, motionless. For 11 years, I've been a dead man walking. Sandra was right. I stopped breathing the night I chose silence over courage. Every morning at 5:37, I'd wake up and feel the weight of that choice crushing me a little more. Every interview I conducted, every story I wrote, every interaction with another human being was filtered through the knowledge that I was fundamentally broken. A coward masquerading as a journalist. Mac's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the act of confession was rebuilding him from the inside out. I convinced myself that my small life was punishment enough, that living with the guilt was somehow penance for my failure, but it wasn't penance, it was just another form of hiding. He looked back at Jimmy, who stood frozen behind his camera like a deer in headlights. You want to know why I made that racist joke when we first walked in here? Because I was testing whether I was still the same man who could watch injustice happen and choose to protect himself instead of the victim. The answer was yes, I was still that man. Until now, the footsteps in the hallway had stopped moving entirely. Rahman Ali was listening too, this ghost who'd waited 11 years for justice to find its voice. I'm walking through this door, Mac continued, not because I'm suddenly brave, but because I finally understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite being terrified. It's choosing to be the man you should have been instead of accepting the coward you became. Ali stood as well, his massive frame unfolding with surprising grace. The path ahead won't be easy, Marcus. They'll come at you with everything they have. Your past, your drinking, every mistake you've ever made will become ammunition. Let them come. The words surprised Mac with their conviction. I've spent 11 years destroying myself more thoroughly than any external enemy ever could. What's left of Marcus Sterling isn't worth protecting, but what he might become, what he might help build, that's worth fighting for. He thought about Karen in Seattle, imagined the phone call he'd have to make. The conversation would be brutal, explaining not just what he'd witnessed, but why he'd hidden it for so long. She might never forgive him for the years of lies, the careful omissions, the way guilt had poisoned every interaction between them. But for the first time in over a decade, she'd be talking to her real father instead of the hollow shell he'd become. Jimmy, Mac said, extending his hand toward the door handle. When you film what happens next, I want you to remember something. This isn't just a story about corruption in Birmingham, or police brutality, or even justice delayed. This is a story about the possibility of redemption, about what happens when a man finally stops running from the worst thing he's ever done and turns to face it head-on. His fingers closed around the door handle. The metal was warm, almost alive beneath his palm. On the other side waited Rahman Ali, no longer 17, no longer innocent, but alive. Alive and ready to transform years of suffering into something that might prevent other young men from disappearing into alleys and shadows. Are you ready? Ali asked. Mac Sterling, who had been hiding in shadows for 11 years, who had built a career on avoiding hard truths and protecting comfortable lies, who had chosen silence over courage when it mattered most, turned the handle. No, he said, stepping across the threshold into whatever waited beyond. But I'm going anyway. The hallway stretched before him, fluorescent lights humming overhead like electric prayers. And there, standing in the harsh illumination with his back to them, was a man who'd been dead for over a decade, very much alive and waiting for his witness to finally find the courage to speak. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Mac stepped into the hallway. The figure at the far end remained motionless, a silhouette carved from shadow and memory. Up close, the institutional lighting revealed cracked paint on the walls and carpet worn thin by decades of transient feet. A fitting stage for resurrection. Rahman, Ali said softly. The man turned. Mac's knees nearly buckled. The 17-year-old boy from his nightmares had become a lean, weathered man of 28. The same dark eyes that had pleaded for help in that Birmingham alley now held something harder. Not hatred, but a terrible patience that spoke of years spent learning to survive in shadows. Mr. Sterling. Rahman's voice carried no accusation, only acknowledgement. You look exactly like I remembered. Behind them, Jimmy fumbled with his camera, the mechanical whir of film advancing unnaturally loud in the narrow space. Mac wanted to speak, to offer some inadequate apology for 11 years of silence, but Rahman held up a hand. We'll have time for that later, he said. Right now, we need to move. Hotel security changes shifts in 20 minutes and we can't be here when they do. Security? Mac's journalist instincts kicked in despite his emotional turmoil. Why would hotel security? Because Bradley's not a Birmingham beat cop anymore, Ali interrupted, gesturing for them to follow Rahman down the hallway. He's Detective Lieutenant Bradley now, with connections that stretch from Alabama to Florida. And because Rahman Ali officially died in that alley 11 years ago. They walked quickly toward a service elevator at the corridor's end. Rahman moved with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to staying invisible, checking corners and listening for footsteps that might signal discovery. The first rule of this new world you're entering, Rahman said as they waited for the elevator, is that truth doesn't automatically triumph over power. Men like Bradley have spent over a decade building networks, accumulating favors, creating systems designed to bury stories like ours. The elevator doors opened with a mechanical sigh. The 4 men crowded inside, Jimmy's camera equipment making the space even more cramped. As they descended, Rahman continued his briefing with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd learned survival in the hardest possible school. The second rule, everyone you trust becomes a target. Your daughter in Seattle, your ex-wife, even Jimmy here. They'll dig into every relationship you have, looking for pressure points. He glanced at Jimmy, who had gone pale. You sure you want to keep filming this? Jimmy looked at Mac, then at his camera, then back at Rahman. I've been shooting sports highlights and puff pieces for 15 years. This might be the first story that actually matters. The elevator reached the basement level. Rahman led them through a maze of laundry rooms and storage areas toward what looked like a service exit. The air smelled of industrial detergent and forgotten things. The third rule, Rahman said, pausing at a heavy metal door, is that justice isn't about punishment, it's about prevention. We're not doing this to destroy Bradley and his friends, though that might happen. We're doing this to save the next 17-year-old who gets dragged into an alley. He pushed open the door, revealing an alley behind the hotel. The Miami heat hit them like a physical blow, thick with humidity and the smell of garbage from nearby dumpsters. A nondescript sedan waited in the shadows, engine running. Fourth rule: the story is bigger than Birmingham. Rahman walked toward the car, his voice carrying a new urgency. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a system. Informal networks of police, city officials, business leaders who've been covering for each other's crimes for decades. We have names, dates, documented connections that reach into state government. Mac felt the weight of what he was stepping into. This wasn't just about testifying to what he'd witnessed in an alley. This was about challenging an entire infrastructure of corruption that had evolved and strengthened over the years since his cowardice first fed it. And the fifth rule? Ali asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. Rahman opened the car door, then looked directly at Mac. Once you're in, you're all the way in. No half measures, no backing out when things get difficult, because they will get very difficult. A distant sound echoed from inside the hotel. Voices, footsteps, the elevated tension that suggested their absence had been discovered. Rahman slid into the driver's seat while Ali took the passenger side. Your choice, Mr. Sterling, Rahman said through the open window. Get in the car and help us build a case that could change how justice works in 3 states. Or walk away and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd chosen courage over comfort. Mac looked back at the hotel, then at Jimmy, who clutched his camera like a lifeline. The voices from inside were getting closer. He opened the rear door and got in. The car pulled away from the hotel with deliberate calm, Rahman navigating Miami's backstreets like a man intimately familiar with staying invisible. Mac watched the familiar skyline disappear through the rear window, each passing block taking him further from the life he'd constructed and deeper into the reckoning he'd spent 11 years avoiding. Where are we going? Jimmy asked, his camera now cradled protectively in his lap. Safe house, Rahman replied without elaboration. We have 48 hours before Bradley realizes his hotel contacts failed him. After that, everything changes. The weight of those words settled over the car like humidity. Mac found himself studying Rahman's reflection in the rearview mirror, searching for traces of the terrified 17-year-old who'd haunted his dreams. The man who stared back carried that boy's eyes, but none of his innocence. 11 years of living as a ghost had carved away everything soft. I need to make some calls, Mac said suddenly. My editor, my daughter. No. Rahman's voice cut through his words like a blade. Rule 6. From this moment until we're ready to go public, you contact no one. Your phone calls are monitored, your mail is read, your movements are tracked. Bradley learned that lesson from Birmingham. Never again leave witnesses wandering free to develop consciences. The paranoia felt surreal, like dialogue from a bad thriller film. But the tension in Rahman's shoulders, the way Ali constantly scanned passing cars, suggested this wasn't melodrama. This was survival. Karen doesn't even know what I witnessed, Mac protested. She's 3 states away, building a life that has nothing to do with this. She's your daughter, Ali said quietly. That makes her relevant to people who think in terms of leverage and pressure points. We contact her when we're ready to protect her, not before. The city gave way to residential neighborhoods, then industrial areas dotted with warehouses and shipping facilities. Rahman turned the sedan into a complex of self-storage units, navigating narrow lanes until they reached a unit near the back. He parked beside a roll-up door and killed the engine. "This is where it gets complicated," he said, turning to face them. "What you're about to see will change how you understand the last 11 years. It changed everything for me." He unlocked the storage unit and raised the door. Inside wasn't the expected collection of forgotten furniture and cardboard boxes. Instead, the space had been converted into a makeshift headquarters. Folding tables covered with photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings. String connected various pieces of evidence like a spider web of corruption spanning multiple states. "Jesus Christ," Jimmy breathed, his journalistic instincts overriding his fear as he began filming. Mac stepped closer to the nearest table. Police reports, medical records, death certificates, dozens of them, dating back years before Rahman's beating and continuing long after. Young black men who'd died in police custody, activists who'd vanished during routine traffic stops, witnesses who'd suffered convenient accidents before testifying. Birmingham wasn't the beginning, Rahman explained, switching on a portable lamp that cast harsh shadows across the evidence. It was just where I entered a pattern that's been operating since the 50s. Bradley and his network have been disappearing problems for decades. One photograph made Mac's blood freeze. A crime scene shot from 1969 showing a young man's body in an alley, labeled as a robbery gone wrong. The victim looked barely 18, wearing the same kind of civil rights button Rahman had worn that night in Birmingham. "Thomas Mac Kinney," Rahman said, noticing Mac's fixation. "Beaten to death 3 days after testifying about police brutality in Montgomery. Official cause, mugging. Reality, he could identify 2 officers who'd been taking money from organized crime figures." The scope of it overwhelmed Mac's ability to process. His single moment of cowardice hadn't just failed one young man. It had fed a machine designed to systematically eliminate anyone who threatened certain people's power. "How did you survive?" Mac asked. "How did you stay hidden for 11 years while building all this?" Rahman's smile held no warmth. "Same way you survived, Mr. Sterling, by becoming someone else. Marcus Sterling, the sports journalist, learned to live with guilt. Rahman Ali, the activist, learned to live as a dead man. We both became ghosts." Ali moved to another table covered with more recent documents, financial records, phone logs, meeting schedules. "The difference is Rahman spent those 11 years gathering evidence while you spent them drowning in whiskey and self-pity." The words stung because they were true. While Mac had been having his Thursday dinners at Flanagan's, Rahman had been building a case that could topple a network of corruption spanning 3 states. "This is what courage looks like," Rahman continued, gesturing at the evidence surrounding them. "Not the absence of fear, but the decision to transform trauma into purpose, to turn survival into justice." Mac felt the weight of wasted years pressing down on him. 11 years of hiding when he could have been helping, could have been building toward this moment instead of simply enduring until it arrived. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Miami, promising rain that might wash the city clean, or simply drive everything darker underground. The storm broke 20 minutes after they'd finished reviewing the evidence, rain hammering the metal roof of the storage unit like machine gun fire. Max stood frozen before a wall of photographs, faces of dead young men who looked like Rahman, like the boy he'd failed to save. When the first car pulled into the complex, "Kill the lights," Rahman whispered, moving with practiced efficiency to douse the portable lamp. The storage unit plunged into darkness broken only by the irregular flash of lightning through the partially raised door. "How many?" Ali asked, his voice carrying the calm of a man who'd faced worse odds in boxing rings. Rahman peered through the gap at the bottom of the door. 3 cars, maybe more coming. They found us faster than I expected." Jimmy's camera whirred softly as he continued filming, though Mac couldn't understand how anything would be visible in the darkness. The young cameraman had transformed from nervous observer to committed documentarian, as if the magnitude of the story had burned away his fear. "There's a back exit through the next unit," Rahman said, gathering armfuls of the most critical documents. "But we can't take everything. Choose what matters most." Mac's hands shook as he reached for files, his mind struggling to process which pieces of evidence were essential and which could be sacrificed. 11 years of living with cowardice hadn't prepared him for making split-second decisions under pressure. Every photograph seemed crucial. Every document potentially the key to justice. Sterling. Ali's voice cut through his paralysis. This is what courage under fire looks like, not the absence of fear. Action, despite terror. Car doors slammed outside, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps moving systematically through the storage complex. Professional, coordinated. These weren't random security guards or local police responding to a break-in report. Take the financial records, Rahman instructed, stuffing photographs into a waterproof bag. The money trail connects everything, Birmingham to Miami to Montgomery. Without those bank records, Bradley's network stays invisible. Mac grabbed the files with hands that barely functioned, his body operating on autopilot while his mind reeled. This was his greatest fear made manifest, not just confronting what he'd witnessed, but becoming an active target of the same forces that had nearly killed Rahman 11 years ago. Lightning illuminated the storage unit's interior for a brief moment, revealing the scattered evidence of decades of systematic murder. In that stark white flash, Mac saw himself clearly for the first time since Birmingham. Not the broken journalist he'd become, but the man he could choose to be, the witness who'd finally found his voice. They're checking units systematically, Rahman reported from his position by the door. We have maybe 3 minutes before they reach this section. The back exit you mentioned. Mac began. Through the wall. I cut an opening months ago, figured we might need it eventually. Rahman's voice held the grim satisfaction of someone whose paranoia had proved justified. But once we go through, there's no coming back. This location is burned. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the metallic sound of storage unit doors being forced open. Whoever was searching knew exactly what they were looking for, and had the tools to find it. What about the rest of the evidence? Jimmy asked, his camera still recording despite the darkness. Gone, Ali said simply. 11 years of Rahman's work, destroyed because we moved too fast. He looked directly at Mac, his eyes visible even in the shadows. Still think this is worth your comfortable life of managed guilt? The question hit Mac like a physical blow. Rahman's entire case, everything that might have brought justice for dozens of murdered young men, was about to be destroyed because Mac Sterling had finally grown a conscience. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed him. Instead, something unexpected happened. The familiar tightness in his chest, the constant presence of guilt and self-loathing that had defined him for over a decade, suddenly shifted. Not disappeared, but transformed into something harder and more useful. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Because Rahman is alive, because we know the truth, because the evidence can be rebuilt, but Rahman can't be brought back from the dead a second time. The sounds outside had reached the adjacent storage units. Voices now, low and professional, coordinating their search. Rahman began cutting through the back wall with a tool that looked like it had been prepared specifically for this moment. The evidence was never the real weapon, Mac continued, understanding flooding through him as he spoke. Rahman is the weapon. His testimony, his survival, that's what they're really afraid of. Everything else is just documentation. Smart man, Rahman said, completing his cut and pushing through a section of metal wall into the adjacent unit. Took you 11 years to figure out what matters, but you got there. Rain poured through the opening as they crawled into the darkness beyond, leaving behind years of carefully gathered proof but carrying something more dangerous, a witness who'd finally decided to speak. The adjacent storage unit offered no sanctuary, only a momentary reprieve before their pursuers realized the wall had been breached. Rahman led them through 2 more units, each connected by hastily cut openings that spoke of months of preparation for exactly this scenario. The rain that poured through gaps in the metal roofing turned the concrete floor treacherous, their footsteps echoing despite their attempts at silence. There, Rahman whispered, pointing toward what looked like a maintenance exit at the far end of the complex. Service road runs behind the facility. If we can reach my backup car. The words died in his throat as powerful flashlight beams cut through the darkness ahead of them. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the exit, their positions blocking any escape route. Professional, patient. They'd been waiting. "Hello, Rahman," a familiar voice called from the shadows. Detective Lieutenant Bradley stepped into the pale light, his face older but wearing the same cruel smile Mac remembered from that Birmingham alley 11 years ago. "You've led us quite a chase, son. Time to come home." Mac's blood turned to ice water. Bradley looked exactly as he had in 1963, unchanged, undaunted, as if the years of Rahman's careful investigation had been nothing more than an amusing game. "Mr. Sterling," Bradley continued, his flashlight beam finding Mac's face, "the famous sports journalist. Funny how a man can build a whole career on watching other people's courage when he doesn't have any of his own." Rahman stepped protectively in front of Mac, but the gesture felt futile. They were trapped in a metal box with armed men blocking their only exit. 11 years of evidence gathering, weeks of careful planning, all reduced to this moment of complete vulnerability. "The storage unit's clean," another voice reported over a radio. "Looks like they got most of it." "Doesn't matter," Bradley replied, his eyes never leaving Rahman's face. "We don't need the papers. We just need the people who read them." The weight of their situation crashed down on Mac with devastating clarity. The evidence wasn't gone, it was irrelevant. Bradley had evolved beyond worrying about documentation. He'd learned to solve problems at their source. "You know what the beautiful thing about dead witnesses is, Rahman?" Bradley asked conversationally. "They can't testify. Amazing how that simplifies things." Ali moved beside his brother, their similarity suddenly striking despite the years that separated their faces. "You made one mistake, Bradley. You let us get this far." Bradley's laugh echoed off the metal walls. "Did I? Let's examine what you've actually accomplished. You exposed your location. You revealed your evidence. You identified your allies." His gaze shifted to Jimmy, whose camera had stopped recording. Even got everything documented for posterity. The tactical brilliance of it made Mac sick. They hadn't been hunted, they'd been herded. Every choice that had felt like escape had actually been orchestrated to bring them to this moment, isolated and helpless. 11 years hiding, Bradley continued. 11 years building your little conspiracy theory. And what do you have to show for it? 3 dead men and a cameraman who's going to have a very unfortunate accident on his drive home tonight. Rahman's hands clenched into fists, his composure finally cracking. "You killed 17 people. We have names, dates, evidence." "Had evidence," Bradley corrected, past tense. "Right about now my associates are burning everything in that storage unit. Turns out homeless people sometimes start fires trying to stay warm. Tragic but not uncommon. The sound of sirens in the distance offered a moment of hope until Mac realized they were moving away from the complex, not toward it. Even emergency services had been neutralized or misdirected. "The federal authorities," Ali began. "Are not coming," Bradley finished. "You think this operation exists without federal knowledge, without federal support? Rahman, son, you've been playing checkers while we've been playing chess." Mac felt his last reserves of courage evaporating. Not just death, the complete erasure of everything they'd tried to accomplish. Worse than his original cowardice, because this time he'd convinced others to trust him, to risk everything based on his promise to finally do what was right. "Mr. Sterling," Bradley said, his voice taking on an almost gentle tone, "I want you to understand something. Every person who dies tonight dies because you decided to grow a conscience. Rahman survived 11 years in hiding until you came along. Think about that in whatever time you have left." The blame settled over Mac like a burial shroud. Rahman alive but doomed. Jimmy dead for believing in a story. Ali destroyed for trusting a coward who'd tried too late to become brave. Thunder crashed overhead as Bradley raised his service weapon, the sound covering whatever final words Rahman tried to speak. Mac closed his eyes and waited for the darkness he'd always known would claim him, carrying the weight of every life his cowardice had cost.